go without the clicker, if that's okay. It's hard to top that performance. And for the last couple of times, for the last couple of months, I've been invited to speak, and I always get the slot after lunch, which makes me think that my job is to sort of put everyone at ease for 5 minutes, you know, take time out of my time to have everyone close their eyes and sort of engage in a little bit of yoga reconnection with their spirit, mostly their solar plexus, of course, having eaten all that food. So, you know, either that or you go into a comedy routine. In other words, you know, you have your choice. You can start sort of straw hatting it, or you can sort of lull people into a false sense of security. I can't do either one. Since I'm talking about global inequality, it's sort of like maybe the idea is that I should speak after lunch so that people don't feel so guilty about what they were going to eat and they've eaten it already. So it is in fact quite a serious topic that I want to spend some time on, but it does make me feel a little Grinchish. You know, it's a little like they used to say about the Federal Reserve Chairman that his job was to take the punch bowl away after the party got started. And certainly after that wonderful presentation of an extraordinarily interesting future, to come back and talk about global inequalities and also inequalities in America leads one into a different space, to be frank. It leads one into a more pensive and reflexive state. And I'm reminded of what the political philosopher Isaiah Blim once said in his biography of Marx, that Karl Marx was quite a character, as you know. You know, they often say the manifesto is the largest in circulation book next to the Bible. And of course, all of you have read it some way or another. If you haven't, certainly you can quote a few words. But the point being is that, however, in his platform manner, this man who launched revolutions all over the world by virtue of his rhetoric was very insistent on absolutely not moving a muscle as he spoke, because he believed, and also his voice was very low, he would be a good postprandial speaker, because his idea was that people should be moved by ideas alone, and that all the rhetorical tricks of the agitator, you know, the soapbox speaker, should be left behind, because it was as if the ideas themselves would imprint themselves on people's minds, and that he wanted to, in a certain sense, stay out of the way of that process. In other words, and simply let the ideas work. And sometimes I think it's better when I talk about this subject not to get too carried away. Like teaching an introductory social science course, you know, and you face the audience and, you know, you want to involve students at this level, you start telling jokes about cartoon shows you've seen and so forth, to, you know, kind of connect with the 250 faces you can't quite see. Instead, I think it's probably important to take a little bit more somber view of these things, because, in fact, they rest upon us in a highly reflective manner as the things we must do. I'm reminded, in a way, of the notion that, in a certain way, we are the product of our choices. Now, this is taken away from the sort of idealism and the kind of, well, I would say almost kind of naive notions that people had over the past quarter century or so, where, you know, thinking will make things happen, and all one needs to do is put oneself in the right frame of mind. You know, this is sort of the sort of retake on the Horatio Alger story, you know, that we can all sort of will ourselves into some sort of perfect space. But the problem is societies can't will themselves the same way that individuals can. They're different things. I mean, for one thing, they're collective. They're consensual if they work well. They're involved in some sort of understanding of all social needs. So that a society becomes, in a way, the sum of its decisions, the sum of the choices that it makes. It is not any longer an expression of collective will, but it is also a reflection of the decisions that we have made that bring us here today. And it's with this kind of somber reflection that I really would like to begin the discussion today that I have the minutes that I have to me. By the way, my Apple computers don't talk to my school computer, which is in Microsoft, so last night I spent 2 hours trying to print out my talk. And as you can see, it's back to 1963. And, you know, the help desk wasn't open because it was, you know, day off, and, oh, well, anyway. Just work for the city. That's all I say. Work for the city. You'll see. My lead sentence for my talk today about progress and rethinking progress was that equal opportunity is not enough. And I'll explain what I mean about that as I go through the talk. But the important thing to remember is that we can think about equal opportunity in a classic sense. In America, we think about the arrival of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, which said that everyone had some access to due process under the law, which then in the 20th century became acknowledged as the avenue by which people would be guaranteed at least opportunities to struggle, opportunities to achieve, opportunities to avail themselves of resources based upon merit. Well, that in a certain sense is the notion of equal opportunity. And at the end of the talk, I hope you'll see my point that we have reached a point in this society, certainly, and I would argue also arguably around the world, but let me focus my attentions today on America by, there will be a few avenues of exploration outside. But what I want to argue here is that opportunity simply, if it were adequate in 1964, before economic decline set into the United States by 1968 and 1970, it is inapplicable today. That is to say, it is an insufficient remedy for the inequality and the costs of that inequality that we face today. So that's how I'm trying to establish a premise here to talk to you today, that we as a nation have made choices and that we can make more again. That is to say, this is not, I don't believe as Marx does that, you know, sort of like, if these ideas impress themselves upon you, you will magically go out and, you know, create a better society. No, I mean, this is a job that we face in the next coming years. But I think we have to start from one extraordinarily incontrovertible and important fact, that growing economic inequality is more true of the world, among nations, and in our own society than ever before since the end of the Second World War. All the things that we imagined that would happen, economic development on a global scale, the development of welfare societies in the northern societies, the development of good societies with growing wealth bases in the South, did not solve the problem of inequality. In fact, the problem of inequality and the costs of inequality have grown, both in the United States and across the world. I want to argue that this inequality is not a natural fact produced by technological innovation, economic development, and/or cultural particularities. The presence and persistence of economic inequality is the consequence of our decisions that compose us as a nation and also a League of Nations. First thing to understand is we've looked very hard at poverty reduction, whether it was in the North or in the South, whether in the United States Congress or in the World Bank and the IMF since World War II. Now remember, I have an 88-year-old father. You know, he fought in World War II. That's a long time ago. No? We have worked on this problem since the Second World War. And we have to understand something, that poverty reduction has occurred. I mean, we just talked a little bit ago about China. And since 1978, over 250 million people have moved out of poverty into some relatively more secure economic base. No? 250 million people. That is shy of the United States, but it's a darn big number. The poverty reduction has occurred in some specific areas. We see now India coming on board with poverty reduction. We see poverty reduction occurring in Brazil. Notice I'm picking out, I am cherry picking very important so-called emerging economies. That has to do with Brazil, and it has to do with China, it has to do with Russia. Well, I don't know about that one, but they use it. And what I want to argue to you is that poverty reduction should not be taken as a measure of increasing equality, because it's a little like the story of the tortoise and the hare. All the time the hare speeds up and develops, the tortoise of the economic inequality continues to patter along. Because in a certain sense, you can bring people from poverty, but you can't prevent, in a certain sense, in a given society like our own, the rich from getting much richer in the process, and thereby relatively, once again, re-impoverishing those who now at least have found some minimal comfort in our welfare system. So what I would like to do is pose two societies together. One will be China, we've just heard a little bit about, and the other the United States. I take them with a little bit of course, attempt to prick your mind a bit, with the notion that basically what we see are two very interesting cases that have interesting outcomes that say a lot about our world these past 60 years. Take China, for instance. Since 1978, this remarkable economic takeoff, the reduction of between 250 and 300 million people have escaped poverty since 1978 by any basic standard of being. But at the same time, economic inequality and the power of the economic elite in China has increased immeasurably. Both of these results, for instance, are the sum of the conflicting forces that drive Chinese society. On the one hand, the Chinese state basically used the peasant to advance by lowering the rice price, by pushing them off into the factories because they were unable to make a living on the land, and then by not granting them any rights. When they came to the cities, the famous floating population, again, of between 200 and 250 million people who had no rights to locale, had no rights to services, who essentially were foreigners in their own land, but who were driven, in a certain sense, off that land as peasants by the mere fact that the Chinese state was transferring the surplus of cheap rice, which impoverished the farmer, for the worker, whom they wanted to get involved in industrialization at low wages. The second thing that the Chinese elite did was they dispossessed people of their land. I mean, you've seen numbers of episodes, the so-called conflict indexes, about how the Chinese have essentially the Chinese Communist Party acting in jurisdiction after jurisdiction has appropriated land. The elite has profited by creating industrial zones, by creating industrial businesses, which they, in effect, either directly or indirectly run. The most extreme example, of course, is now the arrest of Bo Xilai and his wife, she for murder, he for countless embezzlements and so on, and his disgrace from the top of the Communist Party, precisely because it was a business. They had created this massive business that is shamedly true of the Chinese Communist Party, but of course is very difficult to admit. So you have, on the one hand, increasing inequality in a society that is developing. Fewer people in poverty, but people richer and richer and richer, and able to construct a society that works for them and only occasionally for the others. Okay? Well, if you see my point, we're heading in the same direction in my discussion of the United States. What we see in the United States is since the 60s, the economic inequality has grown. Now, there are many reasons for this. We had a dramatic change in the economy. We had a dramatic change in technological innovation. We had the dismissal of vast numbers of underskilled and unqualified workers who had low educational credentials and couldn't really work in the new economy. For all these kinds of reasons, a lousy welfare system. We had a lot of things going on that created this kind of new poverty on the one hand and also increasing inequality. But we had something else. We had a state dedicated to enriching the rich. Since the Reagan regime, taxes for the rich have gone down. Their capital income is taxed at 15%, while normal income is taxed above that rate. Now, there's income that comes in your pocket, the Social Security taxes go out, and you pay your income tax on that basis. So in other words, if I make $100,000 as a teacher, and I pay 20% on that $100,000, if I had the same money invested or received to me as a stock, in a stock dividend, and I cash that in, I would pay 15% on that money, not 20%. Well, this is the simple logic of which is replicated over and over again for how, in a certain way, the inequality leads to a kind of political system that is ungovernable on a popular basis. I was really, frankly, slightly amused by President Obama's flip-flop on the rich issue. You know, a couple years ago, he said, I don't know if you remember this, he came out and he said, we're not against the rich, it's good to be rich. People get rich because they work hard, and that's the American way. And no one in America can speak poorly of the rich, absolutely. And 3 years later at Osawatomie, Kansas, you know, there had been the 99% issue, there had been OWS, there had been, you know, the entire left wing of the Democratic Party thinking they were betrayed. And so he gives a speech talking about the need for more opportunity and more fairness. And now we have the Buffett tax, right? Well, you know, Godspeed, you know, as far as I'm concerned. But let's pay attention to something. Let's pay attention to the fact that this is a kind of Band-Aid approach to the problem of inequality. Reducing economic inequality may not even be the most important thing. Sure, it leads to money in the bank of the United States. Rockefeller, give me 30%. Fine. There's more money in the bank of the United States. But the power remains. The power to make social policy decisions and impose them on banks and impose them on corporations, lead them into the policy networks that create policy at all levels of government. Through philanthropies, through think tanks, through experimental programs, through loans and grants to large institutions and universities and hospitals and the rest. This is the power that creates the conditions for persistent and unsavory inequality. What I mean by unsavory is that it guarantees that even if people's economic position improves slightly, their access to the good life will not necessarily improve. Because there is a relationship in tandem between the economic power and the political power. So one needs to take back the economic power to achieve more, in a certain sense, equitable basis for a society, but one then also has to take back the political power. Now the problem is, of course, they're joined in a nexus. The political and the economic power are in one place. They're in Washington and New York, and basically there's a shuttle in between. But the issue I think that we face in this, and I need to conclude here in 35 seconds or so, is that these, however, are our decisions. These are decisions that we make. And we are responsible for those decisions. That if we choose to live in a society of vast inequality of this sort, we should expect that a declining standard of living. We should expect a more and more undemocratic political system. We should expect that, for instance, in the face of the greatest recession since 1929, that the rich have gotten richer and the corporations have gotten freer. Now, we can change that, but it requires us to take responsibility to face up to the fact that equal opportunity was barely enough in 1964, but doesn't cut it in 2012. Thanks.